It began in the summer of 1994, when the air in the Louisiana swamps hung thick with humidity, and the nights seemed darker than usual. Deep inside the military network, a small group of US soldiers received an order marked with a single red stamp, classified. The mission name was Operation Cypress Dawn. On paper, it didn't exist. In briefing rooms, it was whispered about with unease. The official reason was simple enough: recover a downed surveillance drone that had lost contact during a storm. But the men chosen for the job knew something wasn't right from the very beginning. They weren't ordinary infantry. Each of them had seen combat, trained for reconnaissance and night operations, yet even they could sense that this assignment didn't fit the usual pattern. No backup units, no extraction window, no coordinates matching any official map. Just a stretch of swamp marked by coordinates scribbled in pencil on a folded piece of paper. When the squad sergeant, David Renner, asked command for details, he was told only one thing: retrieve what you find and report directly. No local communication. That was it. No further explanation. By the time their transport helicopter lifted off from the small base near Baton Rouge, the men were already on edge. They joked to break the tension, the way soldiers often do when something feels wrong. But beneath the laughter, no one liked the feeling of heading into the bayou with half a briefing, and no idea what they were walking into. The pilot said nothing as they flew over the endless green stretch of swamp below, mist curling around the treetops like smoke. When they landed on a small clearing of soft mud, the first thing they noticed was the silence. Usually, Louisiana swamps were alive with sound: frogs croaking, insects buzzing, birds crying overhead. But here there was nothing. Just the slow drip of water from the trees and the distant splash of something unseen. The men exchanged glances. One of them muttered, "Feels like the whole place is holding its breath." They set up a temporary radio link and checked their gear. Standard issue rifles, thermal optics, night vision goggles, and a portable receiver to locate the missing drone's signal. The equipment worked fine at first. Renner gave the order to move out, and the squad pushed deeper into the swamp, walking single file on the narrow ridges of half-sunken land. The water on both sides was black and still. Now and then, bubbles rose to the surface and burst with faint plops, echoing in the heavy air. After an hour, they reached the area marked on their paper map. The drone's signal showed faintly on the receiver, blinking every few seconds. They followed it through a thicket of cypress trees where the air grew colder. The roots formed strange, twisting shapes, like grasping fingers rising from the mud. One of the soldiers, Corporal Anders, said quietly, "Anyone else feel that? Like the temperature just dropped?" No one answered, but every man felt it, a slow chill creeping into the air. Unnatural for a Louisiana summer night. Renner radioed base to report progress, but only static came through. He tried again. More static, then silence. The radio had been working perfectly 10 minutes earlier. They switched to the backup frequency. Nothing. The only sound now was the gentle slosh of water around their boots. They decided to continue on foot, reasoning that tree cover might be blocking the signal. The deeper they went, the stranger the swamp became. Thick fog rolled between the trunks, swallowing their flashlights. They moved closer together, every step slower, more careful. Private Dawson, the youngest in the squad, kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see something behind him. When Renner asked what was wrong, Dawson said, "I don't know, Sarge. It's like someone's walking just out of sight. You can feel it." By dusk they reached a patch of higher ground where they found twisted pieces of metal, remnants of the missing drone. But the wreckage was old, far older than a few days. The serial numbers were rusted over, the paint nearly gone. It looked like it had been lying there for years. Sergeant Renner crouched down and picked up a piece. "This isn't ours," he said. "Not recently, anyway." They searched the area and found more fragments scattered in a rough circle, as if something had torn the drone apart and thrown the parts across the swamp. There were no burn marks, no sign of an explosion, just shredded metal and deep gouges in the mud, almost like claw marks. The men didn't say anything at first, but the unease grew heavier with every passing minute. The sun began to set, casting the swamp in shades of black and orange. The fog thickened until even the trees seemed to fade away. They made camp near the wreckage, lighting a small stove for heat. Anders tried the radio again, still dead. "Either something's blocking the signal, or we're not where we think we are," he muttered. Renner didn't reply. He was staring into the fog, listening to the faint sound of movement, slow, deliberate steps circling them in the dark. The sound stopped when he looked toward it. Then came another noise, a low, distant rumble like thunder, far away but deeper, more resonant. It seemed to vibrate through the ground. One of the men whispered, "That's sips, not thunder." Later, as they settled in for the night, they heard splashes in the water nearby, heavy and rhythmic, not like an animal swimming, but like footsteps wading through the swamp. The men froze, weapons ready. Flashlights cut through the mist, but there was nothing there, only ripples moving outward in slow circles. Renner ordered 2 men to stand watch, while the rest tried to rest. No one really slept. The night dragged on, filled with faint sounds that came and went, the creak of branches, something brushing against the tents, a whisper of breath carried by the wind. Each time they checked, the swamp was empty. At dawn, the fog lifted slightly, revealing a set of prints in the mud just beyond their perimeter. They were large, human-like, but too long, the toes ending in curved impressions that looked like claws. Dawson knelt to inspect them and whispered, "Whatever it is, it walked right up to us." The men followed the prints for a few yards before they vanished into the shallow water. There were no drag marks, no disturbance in the surface beyond that point. It was as if the creature had simply stepped into the swamp and disappeared. Renner stood silently, scanning the trees. Something about the air felt wrong again, thick, humming, alive. He turned to his men and said quietly, "Stay close, we're not alone out here." Hours later, Command tried to contact the unit again. There was no response. The radio operator on the other end reported only static, strange, broken frequencies that almost sounded like voices. The last clear transmission ever received from the team was a few words, barely audible through the noise. Still searching, signal found movement in the water, not human. After that, silence. The swamp swallowed the sound, the men and the truth. And when the search teams arrived days later, they found no trace of the squad, no wreckage, and no evidence the mission had ever taken place. Only an empty clearing and a faint echo that seemed to linger in the air, the sound of something breathing, slow and deep, from somewhere just beyond the trees. The swamp had gone silent. The locals of St. Martin Parish had lived with the swamp their entire lives. They knew its moods, its smells, its dangers. They could tell when a storm was coming by the way the frogs went silent, or when the wind changed direction. But that summer, something was different. Even the oldest hunters, the ones who had spent decades wading through cypress and mud, began avoiding a stretch of land they once called Bayou. They said the swamp had gone wrong. The air felt heavy, and the animals were disappearing. It started with the sounds, the familiar rhythm of the swamp, the constant hum of insects, the croaking of frogs, the splash of fish, simply stopped one evening and didn't come back. Some thought it was the weather. Others whispered about something older, something that had been woken up. The Cajun elders called it the Rougarou, a curse from the old world, half man and half beast, born of broken promises and blood oaths. In the small town that bordered the bayou, people began telling stories again, stories their grandparents used to scare them with as kids. They said the Rougarou hunted those who didn't respect the land, those who broke oaths, or those who ignored the warnings of the night. Most of them laughed about it in daylight, but when night came, no one laughed. The dogs howled toward the trees, and no one dared step outside after sundown. There was a fisherman named Auguste Leblanc who was the first to go missing that year. He lived alone in a wooden cabin that sat on stilts deep in the swamp, accessible only by boat. Every morning, the townsfolk saw his lantern burning in the window, a sign that he was still alive. But one morning, the lantern didn't burn. His boat drifted back to shore, empty, the rope at the dock torn clean through, not cut. When a few men went to check his cabin, they found it empty. The front door hung open, the floor slick with mud and something darker, something that looked like blood but smelled metallic and strange. One man said he saw claw marks on the wall, deep and wide. as if a bear had tried to rip its way inside. But there were no bears in those swamps. The sheriff organized a small search party, but they came back pale and quiet, refusing to talk about what they'd seen. They said the tracks they followed led in circles, back to where they started, and that sometimes they saw more tracks appear behind them, as if something was following them from the fog. After LeBlanc's disappearance, more people began reporting strange things. Hunters would return to camp with stories of hearing breathing just behind their tents. Others claimed to have seen shapes moving between the trees, tall and thin, with eyes that reflected red when caught in flashlight beams. One man swore he heard his own name whispered in the dark, even though he was miles from the nearest person. The church in town began filling up again on Sundays. People came not for prayer but for protection. They brought charms, crosses, and old symbols passed down through generations. Folk magic and faith mixed together. The priest told them to stay calm, that there were logical explanations for the fear spreading through the bayou, but even he refused to leave his rectory after nightfall. Then came the screams. Late one night, a family living near the swamp's edge heard something cry out. A sound too deep to be human, too sharp to be an animal. It lasted only a few seconds, echoing through the fog, but it was enough to send them packing before sunrise. They left their house and never came back. When the sheriff went to investigate, he found the front door splintered from the inside and muddy footprints leading out toward the water. The prints were spaced far apart, as if whatever made them was running on two legs. Word spread quickly through the neighboring towns. Hunters began refusing to go near Bayou Marin. Some said the army had already been there once, that they'd seen helicopters circling above the swamp at night with spotlights cutting through the mist. Others claimed men in black vehicles had shown up at the sheriff's office and taken away all the reports. The sheriff stopped talking to reporters soon after that. By the time the military team from Operation Cypress Dawn arrived, most of the locals were already gone. The ones who stayed behind gave the soldiers the same warning. "You can go in," one old man said, "but you best not go in at night. The swamp ain't ours after dark." The sergeant thanked him politely and moved on, but the look in his eyes betrayed unease. That night, as the soldiers prepared to head deeper into the bayou, an old woman approached their camp. She carried a string of bones and charms tied with red thread. Her face was lined like the bark of the cypress trees, and her eyes were sharp. "You looking for trouble, boys?" she said quietly. "You'll find it. The Rougarou walks when the moon's high and the air's still. You see red eyes, you don't shoot, you run." They laughed it off, though none of them found it funny. When she turned to leave, she whispered something in French that none of them understood. Later, one of the men asked what she said. Their translator told them it meant, "The swamp keeps what it takes." As night fell, the fog rolled in thick, covering the camp like a blanket. The frogs started croaking again for a few minutes, then stopped all at once. The sudden silence was heavy, pressing down on them from all sides. One of the soldiers, Dawson, muttered, "She was right. It sets too quiet." Renner ordered everyone to check their equipment and stay alert. He tried the radio again, just static. The compass needle twitched and spun aimlessly. The men grew restless. Somewhere in the darkness, something splashed, slow and heavy, like footsteps moving through water. The locals who watched from the far side of the swamp saw the soldiers' lights fade into the mist. Hours later, they heard gunfire echo across the water, then screams that seemed to stretch on forever before cutting off abruptly. Then came the silence again. By morning, the fog was gone, and the swamp looked calm. But the locals knew better. The air carried that smell again, wet fur and decay, and they knew the Rougarou had walked the bayou that night. None of them went near the soldiers' landing site again. The grass there never grew back, and the water stayed darker than the rest of the swamp. Weeks later, when reporters started asking questions about the missing patrol, the government released a short statement about training accidents during field exercises. The locals didn't believe it. They said the soldiers had gone into the swamp to hunt the thing that was hunting them, and the swamp had simply taken them, just as the old woman had warned. Even now, people in St. Martin Parish say that when the moon rises full and the air turns still, you can hear faint whispers coming from the cypress trees. Some say it's the Rougarou calling out to the next lost soul. Others swear it's the voices of those soldiers, still trying to find their way out. The swamp keeps what it takes. And since that summer night, no one has dared to test it again. The morning sun struggled to break through the Louisiana mist as the soldiers gathered near their transport trucks, boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The swamp stretched out before them, endless and quiet, the air thick with humidity and a faint metallic smell. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural, broken only by the buzzing of a few persistent insects. The men shifted uncomfortably, adjusting their gear as they waited for instructions. Captain Marcus Renner stood at the front of the group, his face half-lit by the weak sunlight. A seasoned officer, he had seen combat overseas and led missions through deserts, mountains, and war-torn cities. But even he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. There was something about this place that didn't make sense, something that didn't belong to the world he knew. The mission briefing had been short and vague, handed to him in a sealed folder marked Operation Roanoke. The documents mentioned unidentified disturbances, unexplained disappearances, and classified biological anomalies. No clear enemy, no coordinates for an extraction point, just a single objective: investigate and contain. The team of 9 soldiers stood ready. Dawson, the quiet sniper; Ramirez, the medic with a dark sense of humor; Holt, the youngest, eager but scared beneath his bravado; and Jackson, the radio tech whose equipment was already acting up. They had been deployed to handle dangerous missions before, but this one had a different weight to it. There were no insurgents or rebels waiting in ambush, just a swamp, and something that lived inside it. As Renner unrolled the map over the hood of a Humvee, he tapped the area marked in red. "This is Bayou, he said. "Locals have reported missing persons, livestock, and other unusual activity. Our job is to secure the perimeter, locate any survivors, and report findings back to command." Dawson frowned. "What kind of unusual activity are we talking about?" Renner paused, eyes flicking to the classified report in his hand. The words were burned into his mind: large bipedal entity, glowing ocular features, extreme aggression, unknown origin. But he didn't repeat them. Not yet. "Wildlife, most likely," he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. "Maybe smugglers, maybe something else. We'll find out soon enough." Jackson kicked at the mud, muttering, "Smugglers don't leave claw marks 6 inches deep." Renner shot him a look. "We stay focused. Follow procedure, no ghost stories." A black SUV rolled up just as he finished speaking. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. No unit patches, no insignia, just expressionless faces hidden behind sunglasses. They didn't greet anyone. One handed Renner a sealed case while the other whispered something too quietly for the rest to hear. Renner's jaw tightened as he opened it. Inside were specialized tracking devices, thermal scopes, and a set of tranquilizer rounds unlike any the team had seen before. "Are we hunting something, sir?" Ramirez asked with a forced grin. Renner snapped the case shut. "We set her here to investigate. That's all you need to know." The man in the suit spoke for the first time. His voice was cold, almost mechanical. "You sit'll maintain radio silence beyond the perimeter. Do not attempt communication with locals. And if you encounter the anomaly, do not engage. Observe and report." "Anomaly?" Holt repeated. "You mean an animal?" The man didn't answer. He just stared at Holt for a moment too long before turning away. The SUV doors slammed, and the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road without another word. The team exchanged uneasy glances. Ramirez let out a low whistle. "Man, I got a bad feeling about this one." Renner folded the map, shoved it into his vest, and gave the order: "Gear up, we move in 10." By the time they reached the waterline, the sun had already started sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the swamp. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and the fog thicker. They boarded 2 small boats, engines humming softly as they pushed through the still water. As they drifted deeper, the forest seemed to close in around them. Spanish moss hung from the branches like old cobwebs, brushing their helmets as they passed. The air was so heavy, it felt like it was pressing against their skin. Occasionally, something large moved beneath the surface, sending ripples across the water. Holt whispered, "You hear that?" Renner raised a hand for silence. The sound was faint but distinct, a low, rhythmic thudding like heavy footsteps echoing through the trees. It stopped just as quickly as it started. No one spoke for several minutes after that. By dusk, they reached the clearing where they were supposed to set up base camp. The area was eerily quiet. No birds, no frogs, just the soft rustle of wind through the reeds. Jackson began setting up the radio tower while Dawson scanned the tree line through his scope. "Anything?" Renner asked. Dawson hesitated. "Movement. About 200 meters out. But it sits not showing up on thermal." Renner frowned. "Could be a glitch." "Yeah," Dawson muttered, "or something cold-blooded." They set up camp quickly, building a perimeter of motion sensors and tripwires. The soldiers tried to joke, to ease the tension, but every sound seemed louder in that suffocating silence. Even the crackle of their campfire felt out of place. Jackson finally got the radio working long enough to send a short message to command. "Base camp established. Proceeding with recon at dawn." Static answered back, then silence. As night fell, the fog thickened again. The fire's glow barely reached a few feet beyond the circle of tents. The men sat in uneasy quiet, the swamp around them dark and endless. Renner sat apart from the rest, reading through the classified file again by flashlight. There was a section he hadn't noticed before, buried in the final pages. It contained an old black and white photo dated 1943, grainy and distorted, but clear enough to see figures in military uniforms standing beside a massive indistinct shape lying half submerged in mud. Its eyes were white, glowing faintly even in the photo. Beneath the image were 3 words scrawled in red ink: "Recovered near Roanoke." Renner's breath caught in his throat. The operation wasn't new, it had happened before. He snapped the folder shut and looked up toward the trees. The mist swirled, and for a second he could have sworn he saw 2 small red lights watching him from the darkness. He blinked, and they were gone. When he finally lay down in his tent, the swamp whispered around him, branches creaking, water shifting, something moving just beyond sight. His last thought before sleep took him was that the old woman had been right. The swamp wasn't set empty. It was waiting. The sun never truly rose in Bayou Marin. Morning came only as a pale grey light that barely pushed back the fog. The soldiers stirred restlessly, faces drawn from a night of half-sleep. The swamp had been alive with strange noises, splashes, distant howls, soft footsteps circling the perimeter. But every time one of them went to check, they found nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the heavy silence returning, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. Captain Renner stepped out of his tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The air smelled of stagnant water and rot, thicker than ever. A thin layer of mist clung to everything. The tents, the rifles, even the men's faces. It felt alive, like it wanted to seep into their lungs. "All right," Renner said quietly, his voice sounding small against the stillness. "We move in pairs. Keep comms open. No one goes more than 50 meters from sight. We reckon the perimeter first." Dawson and Holt took the western edge, Ramirez and Jackson the east. Renner and Corporal Price headed north, deeper into the cypress grove where the water turned black and still. The further they went, the more the world seemed to shrink. Sound carried strangely, echoing off the trees in ways that made it hard to tell what was near and what was far. "Sir," Price whispered, "you ever notice how quiet it is? Like it sits waiting for something?" Renner didn't answer. He just kept moving, rifle raised. Something about the air didn't feel right. The compass needle still spun in circles, the GPS blinking with static interference. The swamp distorted everything: sound, light, even time. Back at camp, Ramirez clicked his radio. "Captain, we found something. USIT want to see this." Renner and Price turned back, moving quickly through the waist-high water. When they arrived, the others were gathered around a half-submerged shape tangled in reeds. It looked like a boat at first, small, wooden, decayed. But then they saw the markings: US Army. The paint had long faded, but the symbol was unmistakable. This thing sets ancient, Jackson muttered. How the hell did a military craft end up out here? Renner crouched beside it, brushing away layers of grime. This isn't Septar's, he said quietly. Look at the design. This model hasn't set been in use since World War II. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Dawson knelt to inspect the hull and froze. Sir, you need to see this. Carved into the wood, deep and deliberate, were the words, "Stay out." The message looked fresh, as if it had been carved only days ago, not decades. The edges were still sharp. Someone's been here recently, Price said, voice tight. Or something, Dawson added under his breath. They moved deeper into the swamp, following faint drag marks that led away from the wreck. The trail wound through the cypress trees until it ended abruptly at a small clearing. In the center was a makeshift altar, stones arranged in a circle, bits of animal bone, and a wooden cross draped with a soldier's dog tags. Holt picked them up, wiping the mud away. Sergeant R. McCall, he read aloud. This guy Sip's been missing since Sep 68, Vietnam era. Renner took the tags and stared at them. His father had once told him about men who disappeared in missions no one was supposed to know about. Soldiers sent into places the government never acknowledged. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe that was what Operation Roanoke really was. A continuation of something buried long ago. Suddenly, Jackson's radio crackled to life with static. At first it was just noise, then a faint voice came through. Help us, they said, not human. Then silence. Who was that? Ramirez asked, eyes wide. Channel 3, Jackson said. But there's Sep's no one else supposed to be out here. Renner Sep's mind raced. The voice didn't sound recent. It was faint, distant, like a recording echoing across time. He forced the thought down. We stick to the mission, form up, we head back to camp before dark. But it was already too late. The fog had thickened again, rolling in fast and heavy. Within minutes, visibility dropped to a few feet. The swamp swallowed the light. Stay close, Renner ordered. Shapes moved between the trees. Quick flashes, almost human, almost not. Dawson aimed his rifle. I saw something. Hold fire, Renner barked. A low growl rippled through the mist, deep and wet, vibrating through the water at their feet. Then another, and another. The sound came from everywhere at once. Something splashed behind them. Holt turned, flashlight cutting through the fog. For a split second, the beam caught a reflection. Two glowing red eyes staring from the water's edge. Then they vanished beneath the surface with a hiss. Panic rippled through the group. Ramirez fired a warning shot into the trees. The gunshot echoed, but there was no response. No birds scattering, no frogs croaking, only silence. Fall back, Renner shouted. Back to camp, now. They ran, boots slamming into mud, branches tearing at their uniforms. The fog moved with them, curling like smoke. Dawson swore he heard footsteps behind them, not human ones, heavier, wet, dragging. When he turned, something massive moved in the mist, its shape distorted by the haze. They stumbled into camp just as night fell. The motion sensors flickered erratically. The lights sputtered, then died. Jackson, get the generator running, Renner ordered. But Jackson wasn't moving. He stood frozen, staring at the tree line. They followed us, he whispered. The men turned out beyond the fog. Faint shapes stood motionless. Tall, narrow figures, with eyes glowing faintly red. Dozens of them, maybe more. Dawson raised his rifle. Permission to fire, sir. Renner hesitated. The words of the man in the suit echoed in his head. Do not engage. Negative, he said, though his voice trembled. Hold your ground. The figures didn't move closer, but they didn't fade either. They just stood there, watching. The longer the soldiers stared, the harder it was to breathe. One by one, the radio signals began to distort again. Static filled the air, broken by faint whispers, words in a language none of them recognized. Ramirez clutched his head. You hear that? It sits inside my damn ears. Shut it out, Renner said, though he was shaking too. Suddenly, one of the motion sensors went off. A piercing alarm that shattered the silence. Then another. Then all of them. The figures were gone. Renner spun toward the noise, flashlight beam sweeping through the fog. For a moment he thought he saw one of his own men, Holt, walking toward the trees. "Holt, get back here." But Holt didn't respond. He moved slowly, stiffly, as if in a trance. Renner rushed forward, grabbing his shoulder, and froze. Holt's skin was ice cold, his eyes unfocused. Then in a flash, he jerked violently and let out a scream that didn't sound human. His body convulsed and collapsed in the mud. When the others reached him, Holt was gone. Only his helmet remained, cracked down the center as if crushed by enormous force. No one spoke for a long time. The swamp was utterly silent again, and the fog pressed close like a living thing. Renner looked into the darkness and realized the truth. They weren't hunting something. They were being lured in. And whatever had taken Holt wasn't set done yet. The swamp was a different world at night, darker than darkness itself, suffocating, endless. The men of Operation Roanoke huddled around what little remained of their campfire, its weak orange glow fighting to stay alive against the cold mist. The water around them rippled occasionally, but there was no wind, no insects. Just the distant, slow rhythm of dripping water and the sense that unseen eyes were watching from the tree line. Captain Renner sat with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, trying to piece together what had happened. Holt's disappearance didn't make sense. One moment he had been there, breathing, terrified like the rest of them, and the next he was gone, leaving behind nothing but that shattered helmet. Renner had seen men die before, but not like that. There had been no sound of gunfire, no struggle, nothing human about the way it happened. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed him whole. Dawson was pacing restlessly near the tents, rifle always raised. His eyes darted through the fog, scanning for movement. "We can stay here, sir," he said, voice shaking slightly. "We need to pull out. Whatever that thing is, it sets hunting us." Renner didn't answer. He looked at the radio beside Jackson, its screen flickering with static. They had been trying for hours to raise command, to reach anyone. But all they got was that same faint hiss, occasionally broken by fragments of distorted voices. Sometimes the voices even sounded like their own. Ramirez sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "You think this is what happened to the first team? The one those suits didn't tell us about?" Renner exhaled slowly. "I don't think they ever expected us to come back." The words hung heavy in the air. The fog thickened, curling between the trees like smoke. Somewhere out in the distance, a splash echoed, something big moving through the water. The sound came closer, then stopped. The men froze, rifles aimed outward, eyes wide. Then came the smell, wet fur, rot, and iron. It hit them like a wave. Ramirez gagged. "What the hell is that?" Renner raised a hand for silence. The swamp went still again, and for a moment it seemed like whatever it was had moved on. But then from somewhere behind them came the sound of breathing, deep, slow, and close. Jackson turned with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the mist. The light caught something just for a second, something tall, hunched, slick with mud and glistening scales that reflected faintly red. Then the figure moved impossibly fast, vanishing into the fog with a splash. "Contact!" Dawson shouted, firing into the trees. The muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, but there was nothing there. No sound of retreat, no body, just empty swamp. The gunfire echoed until it died out completely, swallowed by the mist. Silence returned, thicker than before. Renner grabbed Dawson-Sip's shoulder. "Cease fire. You still just bring it closer." "What the hell is it, sir?" Dawson snapped. Renner didn't know how to answer. The thing they had seen, it didn't move like any animal. It didn't sound like one either. And when the light hit its eyes, they glowed not just red but alive, reflecting intelligence. Jackson tried the radio again, turning the dial desperately. Come on, someone has to be there." A burst of static erupted, then a voice, faint, distorted, echoing, "Leave the swamp, it sets not alive." The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp burst of feedback that made them all flinch. Ramirez looked at Renner. That wasn't set command. Rennerset's jaw tightened. No, it wasn't set. Minutes passed in silence. Then, without warning, every light in the camp flickered and went out. The generator sputtered, coughed, then died completely. The darkness that followed was absolute. "Jackson, get that back up online," Renner ordered. But Jackson was already gone. His gear lay where he had been sitting, the radio still hissing faintly beside it. "Jackson?" Ramirez called out, stepping forward. "Hey, this isn't set funny, man." Something moved in the fog, low to the ground. Ramirez aimed his rifle, the beam of his flashlight trembling. "Who seps there?" No answer. Then a whisper, faint, wet, and slow. It sounded like Jackson's voice. "Help me." Ramirez took a step forward. The beam of light shook as it swept the water's edge. The fog parted just enough to reveal something crawling toward him. It looked human, but its limbs were twisted, its eyes reflecting red. The mouth opened in a silent scream before the body collapsed, face first, into the mud. Ramirez stumbled back, firing wildly. The others shouted, ducking as bullets tore through branches. Renner rushed forward, kicking the body over. What lay beneath the mud wasn't Jackson anymore. It had his face, but stretched, broken, distorted like something had tried to rebuild him wrong. His skin was covered in thin black veins, and his eyes were open, glowing faintly in the dark. "Jesus Christ," Dawson whispered. Ramirez dropped his rifle and backed away, shaking. No, that Sip's not him. That Sip's not." "Stay together," Renner barked. "No one splits off, understood?" The swamp answered with another sound, a long, low groan that seemed to come from beneath their feet. The ground trembled slightly. Somewhere in the distance, a tree fell with a crash. Renner looked around, trying to orient himself. The mist was shifting again, thicker now, almost forming shapes. Faces seemed to appear for a second, then vanish. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping, impossible to understand. Ramirez clutched his head. "Make it stop. They sipped her in my head." Renner grabbed him by the shoulders. "Focus on my voice. You hear me? Focus." But Ramirez was already lost. He stumbled backward into the fog, screaming, rifle clattering to the ground. The sound of splashing followed, then nothing, only silence. Dawson cursed under his breath. "We set not getting out of here, are we?" Renner didn't answer. He just looked out toward the swamp, where the fog was glowing faintly red now, pulsing like a heartbeat. He could feel it. Whatever it was closer. He turned to Price, the last soldier still holding himself together. "Pack what you can. We move before dawn." Price hesitated. "Sir, move where? Every direction looks the same." Renner looked out at the water, the reflection of the red light dancing across it. "Away from here, anywhere but here." As they prepared to move, Dawson suddenly froze. His flashlight had caught something on a nearby tree. A series of claw marks, deep and fresh. Below them was a symbol carved into the bark, the same strange cross-like shape they'd seen on the altar. Only now it was glowing faintly red. Rennerset's voice was barely a whisper. "This isn't set to hunting ground. It sets a warning." Then, somewhere out in the mist, came a sound none of them would ever forget. A howl that started low and human, then rose into something monstrous. It echoed across the swamp, shaking the air, making their bones vibrate. The men stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. When the howl finally stopped, the swamp went silent again. Renner looked around. "Where sips Dawson?" No one answered. His rifle lay in the mud. The water beside it rippled once, then went still. Renner's hand trembled as he lifted his weapon. He finally understood what the old woman had meant when she said the swamp keeps what it takes. By dawn, only 2 of them were left, and the fog was still moving. The fog never lifted that morning. It clung to the swamp like a living shroud, swallowing the last of the dawn light before it could even reach the water. Captain Renner and Corporal Price were the only ones left. The others were gone, swallowed, taken, or turned into something that no longer resembled what they once were. The swamp was quiet now, unnaturally so. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, that made your heart beat louder just so you could hear something human. They hadn't slept. Every time Renner closed his eyes, he saw Holt's empty helmet, Jackson's twisted body, Ramirez disappearing into the fog. He couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp wasn't just killing them, it was changing them, taking what it wanted and giving something back. Something wrong. Price was sitting by the edge of the camp, staring into the water. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. "Sir," he whispered, "it sits still out there. I can feel it." Renner crouched beside him, scanning the tree line. The fog shifted slowly, revealing glimpses of gnarled roots and hanging moss that looked like faces watching from above. "We're getting out of here," Renner said. "We move east until we hit the main channel. Once we reach open water, we can call for evac." Price didn't move. He was trembling slightly. "You don't bet hear it?" Renner frowned. "Hear what?" "The voices," Price said quietly. "They sit to talking, whispering my name. Sometimes they sound like the others, sometimes like my mom." He laughed softly, a broken sound. "She Sip's been dead 10 years, but she keeps saying my name, over and over." Renner gripped his shoulder firmly. "You need to stay with me, soldier. That Sip's not your mother. That Sip's this place getting into your head." Price nodded weakly, but Renner could see the doubt in his eyes. The swamp didn't just kill, it invaded. It got inside your thoughts, made you doubt what was real. Renner had started hearing things too, voices that sounded like command, like his father, like people he hadn't seen in years. They whispered from the water, from the trees, even from the wind itself. He knew they weren't real, but the longer they stayed, the harder it was to remember that. They packed quickly, what little food remained, their rifles, a flashlight with barely enough charge left. The fog thickened as they moved, wrapping around them like smoke. Every few steps, Renner checked behind them, certain he'd see movement. But there was nothing, just endless grey. After an hour, they reached the wreck of the old army boat again, the one with the words "Stay Out" carved into its hull. Only now the carving was deeper, and something wet dripped from the letters. It wasn't water. Price stepped closer, his voice shaking. "Sir, it sits fresh." Renner didn't answer. His stomach turned as he noticed the other marks, handprints pressed into the wood, too large to be human. "We keep moving," he said quietly. But the swamp wasn't going to let them leave. The water around them began to ripple, slow at first, then violently. Bubbles rose to the surface, releasing a stench of rot. The mud beneath their boots shifted as if something massive was moving underneath. "Run," Renner said sharply. They ran, splashing through the water, stumbling over roots and reeds. The fog churned around them, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sound of movement followed, a slithering, dragging noise, like wet leather being pulled through mud. Price slipped, falling hard into the water. Renner turned back, reaching out a hand. But before he could grab him, something surged upward from below. A dark, hulking shape burst through the surface, all claws and teeth and eyes that burned red like fire. Price screamed as the creature dragged him under, the water exploding into a frenzy of thrashing limbs and blood. Renner fired blindly into the water, shouting Price's name, but it was useless. The swamp swallowed him whole, the ripples fading until the surface was calm again. Renner stood there, panting, the silence closing in once more. The water was still. There was no sign of Price. Only his rifle floated to the top, then slowly sank beneath the surface. He was alone now. For a long time, Renner didn't move. His body was shaking, not from cold, but from the realization that he was the last witness to something no one would ever believe. He looked up at the fog, at the endless maze of trees, and for the first time, he felt truly trapped. There was no direction anymore. The swamp stretched out forever, twisting and turning, a labyrinth built to confuse and consume. He forced himself to move forward, one step at a time. Every sound made him flinch, the drip of water, the creak of branches, his own breath echoing in his ears. He found himself muttering just to hear his own voice. "Keep it together, Marcus. Keep moving. You sit not dead yet." Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time didn't work the same here. The fog grew thicker until it felt like he was walking through clouds. Then through the haze, he saw something, a light. It flickered softly, distant but real. A lantern. Renner approached cautiously, rifle raised. As he got closer, he saw the outline of a small shack standing half-sunken in the swamp. The wood was black with rot, but smoke rose faintly from a rusted pipe. Someone, or something, was inside. He hesitated, then knocked. No answer. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the air was dry and warm. Candles flickered on a wooden table, their light dancing across old photos pinned to the walls. Soldiers in uniform, the same kind of uniform he was wearing. Some of the faces looked familiar. One photo showed a group of men standing near a swamp boat, smiling. On the back, written in faded ink, Operation Roanoke, 1943. Renner's blood ran cold. He turned slowly toward the table. There, beside the lantern, sat a single open journal. The handwriting was rough but legible. We tried to burn it. It doesn't burn. We tried to leave. The swamp turns us around. It knows our names. It wants us to stay. God forgive us. It's not a creature. It's the swamp itself. Renner backed away, heart pounding. Then he heard it, the creak of the floorboards behind him. He spun, flashlight trembling in his hand. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall, hunched, dripping with mud. Its skin was grey, stretched too tight. Its eyes glowing faint red. For a second, Renner thought it was one of his men. "Price," he whispered. The figure tilted its head slowly, water dripping from its jaw. Then it spoke in a voice that wasn't set entirely human. "You can leave, Captain." Renner stumbled back, firing his rifle. The creature didn't fall. It vanished into the fog like smoke, leaving behind only the echo of its words. He ran, out the door, into the swamp, through the mist. The fog seemed to close around him, guiding him in circles. Every tree looked the same. Every sound came from everywhere and nowhere. Eventually, he stumbled into a clearing. There, rising from the water, was an old wooden sign. The letters were faded, but he could still read them. "Welcome to Roanoke Swamp, restricted zone." The realization hit him like ice. They were never meant to explore this place. They were sent here to seal it, to keep it hidden, to make sure no one else ever found it again. Renner sank to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. The fog swirled tighter, and for the first time he thought he saw faces in it. The faces of his men, pale and distant, watching him silently. He tried the radio one last time. "This is Captain Marcus Renner. Operation Roanoke. Mission failed. They are all gone. It's sept alive. The swamp, it's sept alive." Static. Then faintly, a whisper came through. "Stay out." The radio went dead. The fog moved in one last time, and the swamp swallowed its final soldier. Hours later, the water was still again. The only sign of life was Renner's flashlight, half buried in the mud, flickering once before it went dark. The swamp kept what it had taken, and once again, Bayou went silent. Weeks later, when the search and rescue teams finally entered the edges of the Roanoke swamp, the air still felt wrong. The mist clung to the trees like smoke from a fire that had never gone out. Helicopters hovered above, their searchlights slicing through the fog, but they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Radios crackled with static, compasses spun without direction, and the GPS units kept looping their coordinates back to the same spot. It was as if the swamp itself didn't want to be mapped. Major Ellison led the recovery team. He'd been part of military cleanup operations before chemical leaks, missing aircraft, even covert recoveries, but he'd never felt this kind of unease. His men were seasoned too, yet all of them spoke in low voices, moving slowly, weapons ready. Every step into the swamp felt like stepping into another world. The team had been sent to locate Captain Marcus Renner and his missing squad, who had gone radio silent weeks earlier during a classified reconnaissance mission known as Operation Roanoke. Officially, the mission didn't exist. The few files that did mention it were blacked out so heavily that it was impossible to tell what they were sent to find. Ellison sat second in command. Sergeant Dorsey approached with a grim look. "Sir, you need to see this." They followed him to the edge of a shallow pool. Half submerged in the mud was a military helmet, the serial number still visible, Holt C. Nearby, tangled in reeds, lay a half-eaten ration pack and a waterlogged map, coordinates leading deeper into the swamp, where the trees grew thicker and the fog became almost solid. Ellison crouched down, staring at the items. "Looks recent." Dorsey nodded. "Maybe a week old. No footprints, though. No sign of a struggle." Ellison exhaled slowly. Or maybe the swamp erased them. The men looked uneasy at that. One of the privates muttered something under his breath about bad spirits, and another made the sign of the cross. The locals they'd passed on their way in had warned them not to come here. Some even refused to take money to guide them. One old fisherman had looked Ellison straight in the eye and said, "If they went into the Roanoke swamp, they ain't coming back. Nobody ever does." Still, orders were orders. They pressed on. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Bird calls stopped. Even the insects seemed to vanish. The swamp water turned from murky brown to an oily black that reflected nothing, not the sky, not their flashlights, not even their own faces. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath misting in the humid air. By the time they reached what their map marked as Site Echo, it was dusk. There, at the center of the clearing, stood an old, decaying shack half sunk into the swamp. The same one Renner had found. The roof had collapsed, but smoke still rose faintly from a rusted pipe. "Jesus," Dorsey whispered. "Someone SIP's been here." They approached carefully, rifles raised. Inside, they found old military gear, photographs, and a waterlogged notebook on the table. Ellison picked it up, flipping through the pages. The writing was smeared, but a few words stood out. "It's not an animal, it's the swamp. It takes voices. It remembers." "Sir," one of the privates called out from outside. "You better see this." Ellison stepped into the fog. The private was pointing toward the water. Floating there, tangled in vines, was a body, or what was left of one. The uniform was shredded, the skin grey and bloated, eyes open but empty. The dog tags read, "Price, A." Ellison swallowed hard. "Bag him, we set taking him back." But as the men waded forward, something rippled beneath the water. One of them screamed as a long, pale arm shot out of the blackness, pulling him under. The swamp exploded into chaos. Men shouting, water thrashing, gunfire lighting up the fog. Ellison fired blindly, shouting for everyone to fall back. Within seconds, the water was still again, 2 men gone. The others were shaking, breathing hard, staring at the rippling surface. "What the hell was that?" Dorsey gasped. Ellison didn't answer. He just looked at the water, where small bubbles rose slowly to the surface, like the swamp was breathing. They retreated to higher ground as night fell. The fog grew thicker, and a strange sound began to echo around them, a low, guttural moan that rose and fell like distant thunder. The men gathered in a tight circle, flashlights trembling in their hands. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, just barely audible over the wind. But soon they grew clearer, forming words. The men froze as familiar voices drifted through the mist. Dorsey, Ellison. The sound came from all directions, overlapping, echoing their names back at them in tones that were both human and not. Some of the soldiers began shouting into the darkness, convinced it was their missing comrades. "Renner, is that you?" one man yelled. But the reply wasn't human. It was laughter, wet, bubbling, and wrong. Something moved in the trees, tall, shifting shapes that melted in and out of the fog. Eyes glowed faintly red among the cypress trunks, watching them. The swamp came alive with whispers, soft splashes, the creak of old wood. Ellison barked orders to fall back, but the path they'd come through was gone. The swamp had changed. The trees were closer now, twisted together like ribs of some enormous creature. The air was thicker. The light from their flashlights barely cut through the mist. They stumbled blindly, trying to find a way out, but the fog seemed to move with them, herding them deeper in. Every few steps, another sound, a cry, a splash, a breath that wasn't theirs. By dawn, only 3 men were left. They emerged on a patch of dry land, shaking, covered in mud and blood. The fog finally began to lift, revealing the remains of the clearing. And there, half buried in the mud, was Renner's radio. Ellison picked it up. The device was cracked and waterlogged, but when he pressed the power button, static burst from the speaker. Then faintly, a voice came through. "Stay out." The voice was distant, warped by the static, but it was Renner's. The surviving men stared at one another. "Pack it up," Ellison said quietly. "We set done here." They never filed a full report. The official record would later claim that the team found no evidence of the missing squad, only environmental hazards that made further exploration impossible. The area was declared a restricted ecological zone, sealed off by both state and federal authorities. Locals knew better. They said at night, if you stand near the edge of the Roanoke swamp, you can still hear the soldiers calling for help. Sometimes you see their flashlights flickering deep in the mist. Sometimes you see red eyes watching from the water. One fisherman swore he found a helmet washed up near the bank months later. Its metal rusted, but the name still visible, Renner. He kept it in his shed for a few days, but every night he heard scratching at the door, voices whispering his name. He threw it back into the swamp. Years passed. The story faded into rumor, then into local legend. The military denied everything, but every few years someone goes missing in the Roanoke area. Hunters, hikers, campers. Their equipment turns up later, their recordings filled with static and faint whispers. Sometimes, just before the footage cuts out, you can hear a voice saying, "It sets alive. The swamp, it sets alive." And when the wind is right, and the fog rolls in heavy across the bayou, the swamp goes silent again, waiting for whoever dares to enter next.